drivers of gender inequality that are necessary to address in the SDG framework with regards to the global finance and macroeconomic and debt policy, global trade rules, and the significant increase that we have been seeing in the post-financial crisis years of the role of the private sector in development and corporate governance. We know that the means of implementation, which entail financial resources, both in the sense of resources and the international financial system, are at the heart of sustainable development financing, which contains three pillars: economic, social, and environmental. With regard to the economic pillar, the Monterrey and Doha conferences on financing for development are strong foundations to draw from. A global partnership, we call for a truly transformative paradigm shift from the global partnership and goal 8 of the MDG framework towards one that actually entails the political will to address international rules in the trade and financial architecture that constrain development-oriented national policies and strategies. With regard to macroeconomic policy and sovereign debt crises, we have seen in the post-crisis years a repeat of the sort of structural adjustment policies that had been decried globally in the 1980s for causing widespread socio-economic harm. Austerity policies involve public spending cuts, pension reform, labor market deregulation, and regressive taxation measures. Many countries have been carrying these policies out in the wake of the financial crisis in the last several years, particularly in Europe, but also several series of UNICEF reports have pointed out with country studies of 185 countries that developing countries too have been carrying out such policies. We know that financial crises and austerity policies hit women the hardest in the form of increased unpaid and care economy labor, unemployment and informal employment increases, higher taxes, and decreased access to health and education. The SDG framework must include a development framework that is both sustainable and gender equitable through reverting the grave threats of austerity policies by supporting and protecting development-oriented macroeconomic policies. This means prioritizing the channeling of public expenditure to key social sectors such as health and education. This means creating jobs and decent work. This means reorienting tax policies away from value-added taxes toward wealth redistribution. This also means managing monetary policy, not just to target inflation rates nationally, but also to serve the needs of the real economy and for inclusive finance, particularly in access to credit and financial services, and particularly for rural women. Indeed, many voices have raised alarm that a lost decade for the world economy would risk the development gains achieved during the last several decades. It throws into question the ability of governments to tackle the most urgent challenges of our age. Similarly, sovereign debt burdens also need to be addressed through an international debt resolution mechanism and some structure to restructure debt in a fair, equitable, and effective means. The Sustainable Development Framework needs to include such a goal on debt, without which urgent limited financial resources of indebted countries, particularly low-income countries that have become more indebted in the last several years since the crisis, these limited and precious foreign exchange and financial resources of poor countries will keep going toward external debt servicing, not towards national development needs. Financialization and financial regulation are also key systemic issues to be addressed. This is a profound issue. We have seen that the international finance, through financial trading and derivatives trading, has created a financial economy that is dangerously disconnected from the real economy: production, direct investments, job creation, and wage growth. This severely impacts women. We have seen, for example, that food prices have experienced extreme volatility in the last several years. This has been tracked and demonstrated to be particularly caused by the kind of financial speculation that investors do on food commodity prices. Women and children bear the highest burden of inflated food costs. Financial trading, especially in vital staple goods, must be strictly regulated to achieve a gender equitable paradigm of food security. Global trade rules, I'll just mention two quick aspects of global trade rules that severely impact women intellectual property rights, especially the amplification of restrictions on intellectual property rights in free trade agreements and investment agreements, impact women and children the hardest, because it makes it harder to access affordable medicines. So we're seeing, especially in the World Intellectual Property Organization and the World Trade Organization, and in investment agreements and free trade agreements, that intellectual property rights is a key structural issue. Sustainable development includes the ability to access urgent medicines, especially for health financing. Investment agreements also limit the policy space of governments to regulate in the national interest. This impacts women because if governments are not able to regulate policies and the interaction of foreign investments and corporations in their national context for the safety of health, their citizens, and their environment, this impacts women in severe ways. And we need to look at these sorts of investment agreements in a more systematic way across the UN's Second Committee as well as ECOSOC. And last but not least, we have all heard that the UN is no exception to the influence of the corporate sector. We have heard much about the Secretary General's partnership facility and the increased role of the Global Compact and philanthropic institutions such as the Gates Foundation in the construction of the Post-2015 Development Agenda. We know that their priorities have been made loud and clear. We need to look at effective ways to regulate the influence and the activity of the corporate sector in the Post-2015 Development Agenda, in the SDG framework, through a governance mechanism that can address corporations in a binding manner. Just recently in Geneva in early December, Professor Stiglitz has called for binding rules on transnational corporations. We know that the UN also had an institute for monitoring transnational corporations, which was dismantled in recent years. So we need to look at ways to revive such an activity or agency within the United Nations that can regulate corporations for the interests of genuine and equitable development. Thank you.